Have you ever tried to resize your sewing pattern, but you failed miserably? Well, I have a simple solution for you. As long as you want to keep the proportions of your project, then you can simply print your pattern pieces at different scale. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to calculate at what percentage to print your pattern pieces at, how to print the pattern at different scale, and how to assemble it. There are different methods that you can use to kind of figure out which scale to print your pattern pieces at. So let's say you already know that you want to make your project 50% larger, which means that you need to print your pattern pieces at 150%. This is great, but you only will know the measurements of your project after it is scaled up once your pattern pieces are printed. If you want to find out the measurements of your project before you print your pattern, let's say at 150% scale, then you can make a quick calculation. So let's have a look. So for the purpose of this lesson, let's say that the height of my pouch is 8 centimeters and the width is 11 centimeters. If I want to print this pattern at 150% scale, so 150% scale, we need to multiply those measurements by 1.5. So if you take this number and multiply it by 100%, that gives you 150%. If you want to print your pattern at smaller scale, let's say you want the pattern to be printed at 80% scale, so less than 100%, then you need to multiply those measurements by 0.8. Because again, if you multiply this by 100%, you will get 80%. So if we multiply 8 centimeters by 1.5, that gives us 12 centimeters. And then we're going to multiply 11 centimeters times 1.5. That gives us 16.5 centimeters. So those will be the measurements of our pouch once we printed the pattern at 150%. So if you want to print your pattern piece smaller, let's say at 80%, those measurements will be 8 times 0.8. That gives us 6.4 centimeters by 11 times 0.8. That gives us 8.8 centimeter. If for some reason those measurements aren't exactly what you are looking for, then you can always try different percentage. And maybe after some trial and error, you will end up with the number that you are looking for. But I like to use different method instead. This time you will only need one measurement. So let's say this pouch is 11 centimeters wide, but I want to make pouch that is 20 centimeters wide. So the required measurement is 20 centimeters. To calculate the scale, all I have to do is to take the required measurement and divide it by the original measurement. So required measurement divided by original measurement, and then whatever I come up with, I need to multiply it by 100%. So in this situation, if we take 20 centimeters by 11 centimeters, we need to multiply it by 100, and that gives us 181.81%. So I'm going to round it up to 182%. Now you know exactly what scale you need to print your pattern pieces. And this works exactly the same way if you want the required measurement to be smaller than the original measurement. So let's say we want the required measurement to be 8 centimeters. So we're going to take 8 centimeters divided by 11 centimeters, and we need to multiply it by 100%. And that gives us 72.72%. So we can round it up to 73%. By using either of those two formulas, you will know exactly at what percentage to print your pattern pieces. To begin, open the pattern file using the Adobe Reader. Once the file is open, click on this little printer icon here. You should see a pop-up window now with all the printer settings. So usually you would print your pattern at actual size or 100%. So let's say if you want to print your pattern pieces smaller, you can simply change the custom scale. So click on that and change it to, let's say, 80%. As you can see in this preview here, the pattern pieces are slightly smaller. So you can simply click on print and print your pattern pieces this way. This, however, won't work if you want to print your pattern pieces larger. So if we look at 120%, you can see on the preview that my pattern doesn't fit on the page anymore. In this situation, use the poster option. So click on the poster tab, and this gives you a slightly different settings. So here, as you can see, our pattern already is divided into two different pages. So now I can simply change the scale to 120%, and you will see that it will still print my pattern on two pages. If we change this to even larger scale, you will notice that now the pattern will be printed on 4 different pages. So the larger the percentage, the more pages it will take to print your pattern pieces. So what I like to do is to add an overlap. So those dashed lines indicate the edge of my paper. And what I like to do is to overlap those two pages to ensure that I can glue or stick them together. Keep the cut marks on. So if I click on it, this is off. So you want to have a little tick mark. This will add additional mark at the corners of your page to indicate how to align your pages. If you want, you can also click on labels. That adds a little note along the page margin with the project name and also the date and time. I typically leave this off because I don't really need that additional information. So now you can simply print your pattern. As you can see, I have printed my pattern. So now we need to assemble those various pages together to create our enlarged pattern pieces. So you will notice that along each corner of your page, you'll have those markings that will help you align those pages together. So I added 1/2 inch overlap to my page so I can easily line up those pieces. So to do that, what I like to do is to take my ruler, take one of those markings, the one that is closer to the edge of my paper, and connect it with the one that is on the opposite side. So I'm going to draw a line from this marking to this marking. Here we go. Then I can take scissors and simply cut it along the line. Here we go. And now I'll be able to overlap those two pieces and glue them together. So you need to place the edge that you just cut at the marking that is further from the edge of your paper, because remember, we are overlapping those two markings by 1/2 inch or whatever you added to your paper. So I added 1/2 inch, so I'm overlapping those two pages by 1/2 inch. So I'm going to line up my edges, my corners, and glue those two pieces like this. So let's do that. I'm going to take some glue and add it along the edge of my paper. And then we can glue those two pieces together. So you want to make sure you are lining up your corners, lining up your markings, and keep everything nice and straight. There you go, just like that. Then you can carry on and repeat the process until you finish assembling all pages. Once you have your pages assembled, you can cut your individual pattern pieces. Before you cut your fabric and make your enlarged project, I highly recommend double checking your seam allowance. So my original pattern uses 1 centimeter seam allowance. This pattern piece now has 1.8 centimeter seam allowance. So if you want, you can take your enlarged pattern pieces and use the seam allowance that is enlarged, but sometimes it might be a little bit more difficult to stitch or keep consistent seam allowance. So what I typically do is to change my seam allowance and keep the original 1 centimeter seam allowance instead. So since I have the stitching line around my pattern piece, I know exactly where to measure and how to mark my seam allowance. So I can just simply follow along this line and mark 1 centimeter seam allowance around the entire panel. If I didn't have the stitching line as a guideline, I could use the edge of my paper to reduce the seam allowance. So to calculate that, you need to take the seam allowance from your original pattern. So again, I use 1 centimeter seam allowance, and since I printed my pattern at 180%, I know that my seam allowance is now 1.8 centimeter. So if I want to keep only 1 centimeter seam allowance, I need to remove 8 millimeters. So I would measure from the edge of the paper, I would measure 8 millimeters and draw a line around the entire panel and then cut it along that line. This will give me the correct seam allowance, even if I didn't have that stitching line. I hope you find this video helpful, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments section. See you next time. Stay crafty, friend.